I once licked a dinosaur bone in the middle of a fossil shop in Tucson, Arizona, while the owner watched me do it over the top of his glasses. In my defense, there's a real reason to lick a rock. Fossilized bone is porous, so when you touch it to the tip of your tongue, it pulls at the moisture and sticks slightly, the way a dry sponge grabs at your skin. Ordinary rock does nothing at all. This is a genuine field test that working paleontologists actually use, and it's also a deeply strange thing to do inside a retail business. The rock stuck. The owner charged me $14 for it and didn't make eye contact with me again. I think about that afternoon more than a reasonable person should, because it turns out I'm nowhere close to the first person to put a dinosaur in my mouth. The difference is that the others weren't trying to identify anything. They were trying to get better. So let's go to central China, to a place called Ruyang County in Henan Province. For about 20 years, the families living there ran a quiet local industry. They dug bones out of the surrounding hills, big ones, heavy, gray, streaked with minerals, and unlike any animal anybody had ever actually seen. That last part didn't worry anyone, because everyone already agreed on what the bones were. They were the remains of dragons, the flying kind. So the village used them the way any sensible person uses a powerful object. The bones were rich in calcium, which meant they got boiled down into soup and fed to children who had dizzy spells and aching legs. They were ground into a fine pale powder, worked into a paste, and packed directly onto broken bones and bad joints. And whatever was left over got sold. A pound of flying dragon went for roughly 25 cents. Across those 2 decades, working steadily, the village ate its way through an estimated 1 full ton of bone. Then, in 2007, a paleontologist named Dong Zhiming from the Institute of Vertebrate Paleontology and Paleoanthropology, the IVPP in Beijing, showed up. Because Ruyang County isn't just a place with hills, it's one of the richest dinosaur sites in all of China. Dong had come to excavate a plant-eating sauropod dinosaur that ran about 60 feet from nose to tail and had been lying dead in the ground for somewhere between 85 and 100 million years. And once the villagers understood what Dong actually did for a living, they did something quietly extraordinary. They went home, collected 440 pounds of the dragon bones they hadn't yet gotten around to eating, and handed the entire pile back for science. Here's the part that quietly reframes the whole story. Ruyang County wasn't a strange one-off. It was the very tail end of a habit older than most countries on the map. The Chinese name for these objects is longgu, dragon bones, and they show up in written medical texts going back to roughly the year 100. The earliest of these is the Shennong Bencao Jing, one of the foundational texts of traditional Chinese medicine, which cataloged dragon bone as a treatment for everything from convulsions to heart palpitations. For most of that history, dragon bone was a loose category that swallowed almost anything ancient and mineralized that came out of the earth. Extinct mammoths, ancient rhinos, 3-toed horses from the Pleistocene and Neogene, the occasional actual dinosaur. And the trade in them wasn't some quaint cottage thing. It was industrial. In the single year of 1885, 20 tons of fossil bone moved out through Chinese ports. And here's a strange footnote to that trade. Some of those dragon bones turned out to be something else entirely. In the late 1800s, scholars began noticing that certain bones pulled from apothecary bins were covered in scratched markings, not cracks, but characters, ancient writing. Those were oracle bones, the earliest known form of Chinese script, questions carved into turtle shells and ox bones during the Shang dynasty and used for divination. An unknown number of them were ground into medicine before anyone realized what they were reading. So for several centuries, an unknown but very large quantity of the planet's fossil record was being quietly converted into medicine before a single scientist could get a look at it. And in at least one case, we know precisely what we nearly lost. In 1935, a German researcher named Ralph von Koenigswald was picking through a Hong Kong apothecary shop, doing what fossil hunters of that era genuinely did, which was shop for groceries with scientific intent. On one of the shelves, sold plainly as a dragon tooth, he found a single molar. It was enormous, far too large for a human, and wrong for any ape he knew of. That one tooth, rescued from a medicine drawer, is the reason science knows about Gigantopithecus, a creature standing 9 to 10 feet tall, the largest primate that has ever existed on Earth. For decades afterward, nearly everything we knew about that animal came from teeth that had been pulled out of the dragon bone supply chain at the last possible second. That's the heist. Not a smash and grab, a slow one. One bowl of soup, one apothecary drawer, 1 ton of bone at a time, running for 2,000 years. Now, it's very easy, sitting comfortably where you're sitting right now, to feel a little superior about all of this. Boiling a dinosaur to fix a child's leg cramp sounds like a setup with no punchline needed. But before you get too settled into that feeling, go and look at what's actually in your own kitchen cupboard. If a child you loved had weak, aching legs, there's a very real chance you'd reach for a calcium supplement, a chalky white tablet you've never once inspected, that you trust entirely on the strength of a label. You'd have no idea where the calcium came from. You'd simply trust the system that handed it to you. The families in Ruyang County were running the exact same piece of logic. They had a calcium-rich material. They had a child with leg cramps, and they had a supply chain they trusted without question. They weren't being stupid. They were being completely normal. Because the reasoning underneath dragon bone medicine isn't actually broken. It's just missing one single word. Think about what a dragon genuinely was to the people using these bones. Not a cartoon, not a decoration. A dragon was the most powerful creature the world had ever managed to produce. And in the older understanding of the body, a creature's strength physically lived inside its bones and its teeth. So if you could get hold of those bones, reduce them to powder, and carry that powder into your own body, you are taking on a real, measurable share of that strength. The system is internally consistent. The reasoning holds together, and the material itself cooperated. Real fossil bone is genuinely loaded with calcium carbonate and calcium phosphate. Feeding concentrated calcium to a child with leg cramps isn't witchcraft. In a rough and entirely accidental way, it's not all that far from what a modern doctor might tell you to do. The one word missing from the entire system was extinct. They had the chemistry roughly right, and they had the dosage logic roughly right. What they didn't have was the idea that these weren't dragons sleeping under the hills waiting to be useful, but the last physical evidence of animals that had been gone for 100 million years and were never, under any circumstances, coming back. Every bowl of that soup wasn't a healthy dragon being shared around a dinner table. It was a one-of-one museum specimen, eaten. China only passed a regulation seriously protecting fossils like these in 2010, the Regulations on the Protection of Fossils, which meant the supply chain Königswald shopped in stayed open for most of a century after he found that tooth. Which brings me back to my rock, and my $14, and the shop owner in Tucson, who stood and watched a grown adult lick the merchandise. The tongue test works for exactly one reason. Fossilized bone is porous, so it drinks. And that's the very same property, that same thirsty, mineral-hungry structure that let these bones soak up broth so well and grind down into such a fine, smooth medicinal powder. The villagers of Ruyang County and I were, in the end, running the same experiment on the same material. We were both putting a dinosaur into our mouths to find out what it really was. I just had the enormous advantage of already knowing the answer. They paid 25 cents a pound to find it out the long way.